Hello, everyone. My name is Glenn Hill, and today I'm presenting my qualitative research proposal titled Bridging the Gap, Superintendent Practices that Strengthen School Board and Staff Relations. This study examines the intentional leadership actions rural superintendents take to align governance, communication, and staff culture. In rural schools, the superintendent often sits at the center of every communication loop, every cultural cue, and every board staff interaction. Because our systems are small and highly visible, the relationship between the board and staff is critical. The purpose of this study is to explore how rural superintendents intentionally build and strengthen that relationship. So, the problem, one of the persistent challenges in rural districts is the gap between what the school board believes is happening and what staff are actually experiencing day to day. Superintendents frequently serve as translators between governance and operations. Yet, despite the importance of this work, research rarely examines the specific practices superintendents use to bridge that divide. Throw on top of this the rural context. In this space, we have limited personnel, we're highly visible, and the relationships are blended in a complex way. So, why does it matter? When this gap isn't addressed, districts experience role confusion, mixed messages, morale issues, and avoidable tensions between staff and trustees. In rural districts, where everyone knows everyone, misalignment can escalate quickly. Understanding the superintendent practices that prevent or heal these disconnects has practical implications for leadership preparation, board onboarding, and district culture. Research questions and framework. The main research question is, how do rural superintendents describe the practices they use to bridge the gap between school boards and staff? Subquestion 1, how do rural superintendents clarify and communicate the roles of the board and staff? Subquestion 2, how do rural superintendents recognize and celebrate staff accomplishments in partnership with the board? And subquestion 3, how do rural superintendents foster collaboration and sustain consistent communication between boards and staff? The theoretical framework, this study is grounded in transformational and servant leadership. These frameworks emphasize vision, trust, service, and the development of people. As I analyzed my pilot data, these frameworks aligned naturally with what superintendents described, such as inspirational communication, service to others, recognition, and community building. These frameworks guided the interview design with narrative questions and the Zoom video. They guided coding lenses. They also guided interpretation of superintendent behavior. The literature review, what the literature says. The literature shows several themes. 1, strong superintendent board communications reduces conflict. 2, recognition and celebrations improve staff morale and engagement. 3, role clarity between the board and the superintendent is essential for stability. And lastly, rural leadership is highly relational and context driven. What's missing in the research is the practices that connect board actions to staff experience, especially in small rural districts. So, filling the gap. My study fills this gap by focusing specifically on superintendent behaviors, how they communicate, structure agendas, celebrate staff, and align the goals. This research looks at the practical bridge work between what superintendents do each day, something the literature often mentions but does not deeply analyze. Through this research, I have focused on the rural context, which in itself is unique. My outcomes started to inform onboarding of myself in my current district. They started to inform communication plans and then started to inform board meeting structures, both in the districts that I researched as well as my own district that I lead. The methodology. This is a qualitative descriptive study. The design is ideal because it captures naturalistic descriptions of superintendent practices without trying to force a more theoretical or abstract interpretation. It allows me to stay close to the participants' language and real-world leadership actions in the superintendent's voice, which is very, very important. The participants in sampling, I sampled 3 rural Texas superintendents. I made sure the participants led districts under 1,500 students, categorizing them as rural. I made sure they had at least 3 years of experience in that role and that they demonstrated visible efforts to strengthen board-staff relationships. The data came from 3 sources. I had structured interviews using the narrative prompts, ended up having too many questions in that, which we'll get to later. Document analysis, I had 3 board agendas, 1 per district that was included. And then I had research memos that I myself took immediately after each interview to track reflections and insights. This is where the Zoom interview came important, because I got a good analysis of the superintendent's background, their desk, their bookshelf, how they had their computer set up, what was in the background, how their office was laid out, the interactions they had with their staff, all through a Zoom interview. So that was a neat opportunity because a lot of what the superintendents were saying matched up with what you could see in their background in the interviews. And then the data analysis. I use Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis. This includes familiarizing myself with the data, generating initial codes, identifying patterns, refining the themes, and then writing the findings. This method allowed for both inductive insights and theoretical interpretation. The themes that began to emerge were clarifying roles through transparent communication, recognizing and celebrating accomplishments, and then collaboration and connection. The coding side of this, transformational and servant leadership concepts served as sensitizing lenses when looking at the data, the transcripts, and the documents. For example, codes relating to visibility, communication clarity, recognition, or service to staff naturally connected to the frameworks of transformational and servant leadership. This combination strengthened interpretation without restricting the participant's voice. Theory was used during interpretation. It was not a rigid code book, but it did help me compare across districts and leaders, which I think strengthened the credibility of the codes that emerged and the leadership theories that were used. If I were going to continue to do this and do it at the full dissertation level, the proposed research timeline would be a little bit different than the research timeline that was used on this pilot study. Roughly, I would think it would be around 5 to 6 months. Month 1 would be to get IRB approval, submit the protocol, the recruitment materials, and the interview guide. Month 2 would actually be the recruitment side of things, emailing the invitations. I would focus on Texas Association of School Administrators, or TASA, focus on local ESCs and other ESCs I've been a part of, the regional service centers, and then probably look at TREA, Texas Rural Educators Association. All 3 of these I'm a part of currently. This would give a good pool of interviewees. In fact, TASA actually has a rural cohort that I'm a part of for rural superintendents. So that would be good to tap into that. Month 2 would also be used to schedule the interviews. Months 3 through 4, data collection, conducting 8 to 10 interviews, and then the collecting of the actual documents. Months 4 to 5 would be actual data analysis, coding, theme development, and then months 5 through 6, the writing, and then the implications. The findings, discussion, superintendent-specific recommendations would be important during this time period, and that's one thing that I found important from my interviews is getting the recommendations from superintendents after having the interviews on some of the findings that I had, maybe just clarifying some of the responses that I was given. This timeline, I feel like, reflects a realistic balance of school leadership responsibilities as well as research expectations in the process. In closing, the significance from the study, I feel like this research has core implications for rural leadership. I feel like it could strengthen superintendent preparation, improve board onboarding, and it could also identify practical strategies for aligning staff culture with governance expectations. What I'm excited for out of it, I feel like most, is how immediately applicable this study is in my own work in my own district. Even in the pilot data that I found, I gained some great ideas. For example, one I gained was the Tell Me Something Good that was included on a board agenda that I'm thinking of adding to my own personal board agenda. That item is something that school board members at Runge ISD at the beginning of the school board have to tell something good that they personally saw within their district in between the last 2 board meetings. I think that's good because the superintendent said that it pits them in a position where they need to go find something good, but then B, staff get to hear that the board is engaged and the board knows kind of what's going on. So I think that's just one quick example of why selfishly that helps me in my current position. But I'm also genuinely excited to learn from other superintendents, apply their strategies in the ways that they've strengthened their culture and communicate within their rural districts. And I feel like that's something across the board in Texas we can share amongst rural leaders. Changes that I would make after this pilot study: 1, I had way too many scripted questions. I need to have less. Superintendents like to talk. And so giving them that opportunity to elaborate is important because I feel like I didn't allow that time in my interview because we were just trying to get it done. And lastly, I knew this going in, but it definitely was magnified in the study, is that board relations are sticky subjects, especially for superintendents. Sometimes we don't want to share what's going on. I feel like through this pilot study, as well as through the real research, it'd be important to stress over and over again confidentiality, the use of pseudonyms, even though that was used here. But I also think in so doing this, with the cooperation of TASA, Texas Association of School Administrators, or superintendents that know me personally would be helpful for honesty, because a lot of times superintendents don't want to be honest. They don't want to be real about their board. They just want to say, yeah, everything's great. There's no issues. And my board does a great job. So I actually enjoyed this research. It fit with what I was doing. And I feel like I became a better superintendent after it, which excites me for the future potential use of this in a dissertation.